Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us for the London and Middlesex Ontario Ancestors presentation for February 2nd, 2019. Our special guest presenter today will be Jennifer Robertson, and the title of the presentation is Preserving the Past, Preservation and Conservation of Archival Materials. Jennifer Robertson is an art conservator specializing in the conservation and preservation of archival materials, fine art on paper, and rare books. She's accredited by the Canadian Association of Professional Conservators. Jennifer's specialty is conserving paper-based materials such as documents, maps, photographs, prints, drawings, watercolors, and bound volumes. She has experience working with many types of media and materials from the 15th to the 20th century. Through her business, book, and paper conservation services, she provides consultation, conservation treatment, preservation strategies, and condition surveys for art and archival institutions and private collectors across Ontario. Her clients include major collections such as Western University Archives, Museum London, the University of Waterloo Special Collections, and the Art Gallery of Windsor, and more. For more information, you can visit her website at www.booksandpaperconservationservices.com. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you everyone for inviting me here to speak to you today. My name is Jennifer Robertson, as Drew said, and I'm here to talk to you about the conservation and preservation of archival materials. I'm a little bit nervous, but I'll get into it quickly and it'll be better. The first few minutes are always difficult. So I understand your group is interested in documents and artifacts related to your genealogical research. And probably most of you have documents and papers in your collections that are delicate and damaged. I hope you'll find this presentation interesting and maybe come away with some new information and ideas for preserving your own documents. Hopefully the technology works. There we go. So in the presentation, I will first of all introduce myself and my work a little bit. I'll tell you about my background and my private practice working as an art and archival conservator. Then I'll discuss different materials and artifacts that might be commonly found in family history collections and the types of damages and risks to stability that these artifacts often suffer. Actually, yeah, is it possible to turn off the lights close to the screen?
If we do that though, I think...
Or leave some backlights on maybe?
Maybe if we leave these ones on and turn that one off.
Yeah. You'll be able to see a lot better. There we go.
Yeah,
all right. Yeah, so we'll discuss types of damages and risks to stability that these artifacts often suffer. And I'm going to use examples from projects that I've worked on in my studio to show what can be done for various condition issues with documents and artifacts. And then finally, I will give you some advice on preservation measures that you can take for your own materials, including we'll talk about environment, proper storage and handling practices, and some basic repair do's and don'ts. As I said, I'm an art conservator. I'm working privately here in London, and I specialize in the treatment of fine art on paper, archival materials, and rare books. I have a background in fine art. I did my undergraduate degree at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, and I later earned my master's degree in art conservation from Queen's University in Kingston. I followed that up with further training in the United States and the UK, doing various internships and fellowships at institutions including Johns Hopkins University Libraries, the Smithsonian Institute, and the British Library. I've also done contracts with the Canadian Conservation Institute in Ottawa, and when I returned home to London, I worked with a private conservator at Museum London, learning to work in private practice. Oh, there we go. So in 2016, I opened my own company, Book and Paper Conservation Services, focusing on treating works on paper, including archival materials, rare books, and fine art on paper. I have a lovely home studio where I work most days and I meet clients by appointment, which gives me lots of flexibility to spend time with my favorite studio assistant, my 1-year-old daughter. I work for many institutions across southwestern Ontario, including art galleries, museums, libraries, and archives, as well as for private collectors. I have a particular interest in historical materials, and I'm going to focus on that area in this presentation since I think that's what you're most interested in. On a genealogical note, I grew up here in London, and much of my family is from the Watford area near Sarnia, as well as Parry Sound further back. I hail from Scottish, English, and Irish ancestry, as I'm sure many of you do. And here is my little girl Hazel last summer, getting started early and learning about her Greer family relatives. There we go. Okay. So let's back up a little bit. First of all, what is art conservation? Art conservation is a scientific and technical practice aiming to preserve and restore important cultural objects in order to prolong their useful life. An art conservator uses scientific examination, knowledge of chemistry, and an understanding of the composition of materials, combined with technical and hands-on skills and tools to repair and stabilize and restore cultural objects. The term for the profession is art conservation, but of course that includes many types of objects: paintings, ceramics and metal objects, textiles, and of course works on paper. And that paper would include anything in the way of archival documents, photographs, maps, blueprints, and any other paper-based item. Here we go. So some of the goals that we focus on when treating objects include removing damaging components of artworks to prevent future deterioration, conserving and stabilizing to prolong the life of the original materials, restoring aesthetic integrity where it's possible, and providing correct storage and environmental conditions to ensure the safety of the objects going forward. I'm just going to make a side note here about the difference between conservation and restoration. You've probably heard the word restoration used before, and that's certainly part of what I do, but art conservators prefer to use the term conservation instead. A conservator follows a very rigorous code of ethics when they're working, which includes being careful to stay true to the original materials and the artist's intent of a piece. Where a restorer might, say, repaint losses in a picture the way they imagined they might have looked, or restore a finish on an object according to taste, a conservator will only stabilize and repair to the extent that the evidence shows what was originally present. So we're not adding anything new into a piece. No matter what date you ask me to write on your document, I'm not going to put it on unless it was there originally. So I'm not going to take an artifact and make it look new again by replacing areas. I'm only going to stabilize the original materials and make sure they are preserved going forward. And everything that I do to a piece must be stable and not going to cause any further damage or deteriorate further itself. And it must be reversible as much as possible. So in the future, if somebody decides that those repairs were inappropriate, they can be removed without causing any more damage to the document. This is just a quick example from the art world. This painting by the Italian artist Masaccio was, quote, restored during a time of more conservative values. You can see they've added something on there. And obviously not according to the original design that the artist intended. The restoration was later reversed, revealing the original image once again, because we want to see what the painting would have originally looked like. All right. There we go. So now back to archival materials, the kinds of things that you're probably most interested in. Archival or historical materials can include a lot of different objects, and I get a wonderful variety of these items through my studio from both archives and private collectors. The images in the following slides are all pieces that I've treated personally over the last few years. So we could be talking about handwritten letters, certificates, or documents, maybe with wax or paper seals affixed to them, or parchment documents or indentures. We have a letter in iron gall ink. This is a document on parchment. This one had a beautiful wax seal on the bottom, and documents that are, you know, partly printed and partly handwritten on. Photographs in various formats, salted paper prints, panorama prints, gelatin developed out snapshots, pastel or charcoal portraits. Maps, either hand-drawn maps or printed. These two are hand-drawn maps, early maps of certain areas of the townships. These two are both Tremaine County wall maps. Probably seen those before, quite large and quite damaged usually. They're hard to take care of. Architectural drawings or blueprints to houses or buildings. Got a church there and a private residence there. And 20th century or 19th century printed materials like advertisements, brochures, posters, newspapers, that sort of thing. And finally, books. Most often in family archives, it's family Bibles. A lot of those come into me. But also I work on things like ledger books, atlases, photo albums, scrapbooks, as well as more rare materials, you know, that would be part of a museum collection or something like that. Fine art on paper, I'll just touch on briefly, but we'd be talking about watercolor paintings, drawings and sketches, prints or photographs. I won't talk about the art on paper too much, but that's also the type of thing that comes into my studio. Okay. So, as for damages, those are the type of objects that I regularly work on, and there are probably many items from the last slides that you recognize from your own collections. Perhaps you also recognized some of the different types of damage and deterioration that can be found on those artifacts, maybe from your own items. So now we're going to talk about damage and deterioration. As we all know, old paper is very fragile. When we handle pieces, we often feel they're going to crumble in our hands. They might break while being lifted, chips and fragments fall off, they're visibly yellowed, stained and brittle, maybe dirty, maybe moldy. If I sound excited, I am. I actually find badly damaged papers very, very interesting. The worse condition, the better for me, because that means that I can make a dramatic improvement in them, which is always fun. I get really excited when someone brings me a dirty, moldy, stained, and torn old piece of paper. So there are different categories of damage. We've got mechanical loss, or mechanical damage rather, and that would be anything physical to the paper, tears, breaks, chips, losses, abrasions, that sort of thing. Stains and dirt, that could be water stains coming from a flood or other event, or spills, foxing in the paper caused by different impurities in the paper fibers, any surface dirt, dust, debris, biological residue like cobwebs or insects and that sort of thing. Tape and adhesive residue. Tape is evil. Tape is the bane of the paper conservator's existence, and I'll talk about it a lot more later, but it's one of the most common problems that I find on items coming in. Old tape, I'm sure you've seen, becomes brittle and yellow and stains the paper. Light damage, that would be overall yellowing and darkening of the paper. It becomes brittle. Fading of inks and pigments can be caused by light exposure. Brittleness and acidity, that is often inherent in the documents if they're made on wood pulp paper. That paper is inherently acidic, and also acid migration can come from surrounding materials like the backing on a picture frame, or if they were stored in an album with poor quality paper pages and that sort of thing. And then mold, finally, if we have any moisture getting into your objects, that can cause black or green mold. It can be actively growing, it can be old and just sitting still on the surface, and it will stain the paper, weaken the paper, sometimes make things just fall apart completely. So I'm going to go over each of these problems in a little bit of depth, talk about the causes, visible damage, and the potential risks, and discuss treatments and prevention strategies. And I'm going to do it by sort of going through a number of treatments that I've done in my studio that have addressed these problems. And then we'll talk about, so most of these problems are really common, and you'll see things in your own collections, and there are things that you can do to mitigate the damage, and certainly things that you can do to prevent it from getting worse. But I do want to warn that actual conservation treatments are usually best left to a conservator. I can't tell you how many times I've had people bring something in and say, I tried to fix it, look what happened, can you help me? So I know that you're hoping also for things that you can do at home, so at the end then I will have a section and talk about what type of things you can do for your own collections to keep them safe and to do as much preservation as is good for them. Okay, now the fun stuff. So, let's see, this was a fun treatment that I did quite a few years ago now, but I like to bring it out because it's a really great example of mechanical damage. Mechanical damage, as I said, is anything involving the physical breakage to the paper substrate. That would include tears, breaks, chips, abrasions, creases, and lost pieces or fragments. Mechanical damage can be caused by less than ideal storage or handling conditions, accidents, paper that's weakened just due to its composition and being acidic, or from general use. So this was a broadside advertisement poster. It was brought in by a private client, a family, and this was the sale of the business that belonged to their grandfather, I believe. 1920, found folded up and stored in an envelope. Of course, it's on wood pulp paper. It was just meant to be ephemeral, just posted and then thrown away. It wasn't meant to last for 100 years. But it did, but the quality of that paper means that it was very brittle, and it, when it was folded, of course, creased and broke along those creases and pieces were falling off. So, luckily, they had stored it in an envelope, and most of all of the pieces were still present. It hadn't really lost. There were a couple little fragments that were lost, but I was able to piece it all back together. And often the treatment for putting together a whole sheet like that, that's very weak already, is to line it onto a new backing paper. In conservation, we use a paper called Japanese paper or Japanese tissue for a lot of things. It's a very well-made, stable, long-fibered paper made from mulberry trees, and it will stay for a very long time. It won't become brittle or acidic the way some of those old papers do, and it won't yellow. So I use that a lot for repairs, for lining the backs of things. And along with that, I use the adhesive wheat starch paste to glue things together. So it's sort of like a flour paste that you might have used in kindergarten, but it's a very refined, specific formula of that sort of thing. But it's an adhesive that won't yellow, won't become brittle, won't fail in the future, and it is reversible as well, wheat starch paste. So if ever in the future those repairs need to be undone, just a little bit of water and moisture will let go. So when I show a lot of treatments here where I'm doing repairs, those are the materials that I'm using. So in this case, we started by doing some surface cleaning on the paper to remove any loose dirt sitting in the paper fibers. Then it was washed to remove some of the acidity and the yellowness and deacidify it at the same time with an alkaline buffer solution. And that gave the paper some more strength and flexibility, and then allowed me to go to the next step of lining. So all the pieces were lined up in the correct locations, and it was laid down onto a new, strong, supple sheet of that Japanese paper. There it is drying, and afterwards, we've got it back in good condition. It's now one full sheet of paper that can be handled safely, moved around without risk of any more of those pieces coming off and getting lost. I like that one because it's nice and dramatic. Not everything comes out perfectly restored at the end. A lot of times you're just trying to get it better. It will never look new again, but I do the best that I can to get things looking better enough that you can appreciate them again without them being at risk of falling apart. So this is another one that also had mechanical damage, but also a lot of tape and adhesive were complicating things. This was a birth certificate, 1905, brought in by a private client, and she had found it in her, I think in her mother's papers. I'm not sure if it was her mother or her grandmother, but all folded up into this little packet about 3 by 4 inches. And it was so brittle and crumbling that she didn't even want to open it up, because as she was touching it, she was losing more pieces from it. So she brought it in like that. And my first step was to humidify it in order to relax the paper fibers and open it up without causing any more damage. So once we got it open, we could see what was going on inside, and there was a lot of tape. Somebody had tried to tape it with a lot of different types of tape. So there's this kind of crispy cellophane tape that was becoming yellow and brittle on it, and the creative solution of using Band-Aids. So somebody had clipped parts of the Band-Aids and used those to stick the pieces back together. As I said, tape is evil. And it's easy for me to get angry about it, but that's what people had close to hand, and that's what they thought was best for the document. They wanted to hold it together. They didn't know that it was going to become brittle and cause all that staining in the future. And it did its job of holding those pieces back together. So I tried, to contain my rage with tape. But it does cause a lot of damage that then needs to be reversed if we're going to be able to repair the document. For me to take that tape off, and more specifically the adhesive residue underneath the tape, is quite a process. It involves using solvents to disperse that adhesive. It's usually not the tape carrier that is the problem, that's the plastic surface that the adhesive is then mounted to. That will often just fall off over time, but then that adhesive residue becomes hard and brittle, gets embedded into the paper fibers, stains them, and ultimately weakens that area of the paper further. So there is the process of cleaning, of treating that with some solvent through suction to try to release that residue out and flush it out through the back of the paper. I always try a variety of different solvents to find out what works. I think in this case it was acetone. Sometimes you have to go up to toluene or hexane or some of those more toxic ones, although I really do try to avoid those if possible. And it's quite time consuming to do. So never use tape on your documents. I'm sure you knew that already. Unfortunately, there were some panels missing on this one, but we did find that most of everything that contained handwritten text was present. So when we repaired it, she was able to see everything that had been written and see the names and the dates on that birth certificate. Her her ancestor was actually Polish and had immigrated. So it was interesting. The document was Canadian. It had a Canadian seal on the bottom, but the text was all written in Polish. And I'm not sure, it might have actually been more like a christening date in certificates. But she was really pleased to be able to access that information, of course. So the end treatment was similar to the broadside before, where I lined it onto a sheet of Japanese paper, which then sort of created it back into a sheet of paper the size that it would have been, and then you can now handle that, move it around, get it out and look at it without risking having any more of those pieces falling off. This was a great one too. I'm just wondering, can you guys see very much of that detail on there? Is there a way to focus the projector a little bit more?
Focused as I think it gets.
What's that?
I think it's as focused as it
It
gets.
is, yeah? Okay. I should put some more close-up
Maybe
details. Is that a little bit better? This may be a little bit better, right? Okay. So this was a hand-drawn map, early map of Sarnia, Ontario, 1848. It was brought in by the Lambton County Archives for treatment. And it's hard to see, but it's titled Plan of Parts of Lots, and I think it's like 70 through 75 or something like that, of Sarnia, Township of Sarnia. So it's just a small section of the town, but it's divided into the lots with lot numbers. So that might be something that's of interest to a researcher who's looking to trace the ownership of different areas. This one had a lot of different problems to it. It had mechanical damage, there are tears and breaks and losses. You can't see too much, but on the back there is tape residue where someone has tried to repair those big long tears in it. And it had just a lot of surface dirt on it. Surface dirt doesn't necessarily cause too much damage, but it can make it difficult to read and difficult to appreciate that document fully. So doing a good old-fashioned dry surface cleaning can make a lot of difference. And that's the case in this one, so that's why I'm showing you this one. And let's see if I can get my video to work. Screen. It's too bad. Okay, we might get this one. I'll show you after on my computer. Yes. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is on the back. Unfortunately, we don't get to see the front. I'll maybe show you after we disconnect the projector. But that's the reverse of it. You can see all of that tape on there and the cleaning. So it's just a little time lapse of the cleaning going through there. And you can see the dramatic difference that is making as we go across. All that dirt coming off and then the tape coming off. And you can trust me, it was just as dramatic on the front too. I will show you that, remind me afterwards, I'll just put it on my laptop. So once we got the surface cleaning done, it was tape removal, again with a small swab and solvent, getting that adhesive residue out, and filling the losses, so I'm tracing those losses with Japanese paper to fill. And then there was a lovely little green silk ribbon around the perimeter, which got sort of shaped back into place with some humidity and then a little bit of heat application. And afterwards, we have the before and the after. So it makes a big difference just doing that surface cleaning on there. And I mean, you could read the text before, but you can read it so much more easily once it's cleaned and it's fresh looking. All right.
What do you use to dry clean with?
I will get to that, and I have some examples as
Okay.
well, because that's something that I think you guys probably could do for your things, yeah.
Okay, and when you use the Q-tip and you put it on there, does it just dissolve? With the tape, like the leftover tape?
It does a little bit, but there's different factors. I use a suction platen underneath to take it out. If you just put a solvent on something, and I really wouldn't recommend that you try this at home, because it will just make a big stain in it. So there's different controlling factors that have to be kind of taken into account for that. And they're sort of rolled swabs, so I roll my own swabs so that they're very, very tiny and controlled. I'm not just using Q-tips at home. A lot of the tools and things that I use look like things that you might find around at home, but they're actually sort of more very specific conservation versions of those types of things. Again, I wouldn't try, these treatments that I'm showing you are really rather complex things, and I wouldn't recommend that you try those things unless it's something throwaway that you really don't care about damaging. But there's a lot of I do a lot of testing first and a lot of research to make sure that before I start these treatments that they're going to go right and not cause any more damage or staining to things. So it might look like I'm just jumping in there, but I do a lot of stuff beforehand to make sure that it goes right. Especially with this one. And this is a really great one with a dramatic result that I like to show, but don't try it at home. Because this one had a lot of staining on it, so in this treatment I'm doing washing and bleaching of the paper, but that's something that's very controlled and chemically advanced. So anyway, I'll get into talking about it in a sec. So this was a really great treatment that came in a couple of years ago now, private owner, and it was a drawing of the Lord's Prayer that had been done by his father or grandfather, I think, as a young boy, and it was probably a penmanship exercise or something like that, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but the detail on this drawing was just exquisite. I have a little bit of a close-up later on, but all of that lettering done by hand, all of those little flourishes, little vignette of the boy praying.
I thought that was an elephant.
Oh. I think I have a close-up of it later on. It's not very clear on the screen, but so it would have been done with you see it now? Yeah, sitting by his bed praying. Would have been done with a dip pen and ink. And I think he was like under 10 years old when he did this. The name and date was written on the bottom. And in it, a beautiful original wooden and gilt frame as well. There's a lot of really nice wood grain in that you can't really make out. But it came in with all of this heavy, heavy brown staining on the paper. And this is something that is really common. A lot of paper objects have had staining over the years. This one in particular was caused by an acidic backer board on the back of the paper. Really common, they would, especially with drawing papers, mount them to a backer board. If you've ever had an old watercolor, photos are often mounted on that kind of board as well. It's like cardboard, like it's the same material that cardboard would be, a very brown, very acidic wood-based board, but it's dense and thick. I call it pulp board. It's just like a compacted, pulpy stuff. And an adhesive, so there's an adhesive then holding the paper onto that board, which has also turned brown, and those two materials have migrated that brownness and the acidity and caused the paper to stain. In that staining, you could actually see brush strokes of the adhesive that were then turning brown on the paper. So very common. I do a lot of them. Very time consuming because that backer board has to be removed before anything can be done on the paper. And it has to be removed layer by layer from the back to the front. So scraping, I scrape it away and remove it just fragment by fragment. If you try to go from the front, guaranteed you'll puncture the paper. I've had a lot of people try it. If you can get in a little spatula on the side or something, you think, oh, I can just kind of work this off. Don't even try it. You get a big hole in it. I've tried it. I've gotten big holes in it. Not recently. So anyway, that's the first step of the process. It takes a really long time, but it's essential. It has to be done. You have to get that acidic material off of the paper. Once that's off, then we can address the staining. So this is showing a little bit of testing, and you can see just a little bit of that penmanship there. Those letters were all done three-dimensionally with little dots and borders on them, and then all of these flourishes, and it was just gorgeous. So I then conduct some testing on the piece, make sure that the inks are stable, make sure that they're not going to be affected in any way by the treatment, and testing that brown to see how it's going to react to washing and bleaching treatment. And in this case, I could tell that it was all going to work out great. Doesn't always happen that way. But so I went through with a wash. There it is at the start. After one wash, after a second wash, after a chemical bleach, and after further application of the bleach. When I say bleach, I'm not talking about Javex. Please don't ever try that. That's a very harsh chemical, and it will damage your paper. It might not look like it, might make it look white, but it's causing damage to the paper fibers, and it will just accelerate the aging and the deterioration, and it'll fall apart. So what I use is a specially researched and tested conservation bleach. There are a number of them that I use. I just choose the one that's most appropriate for a piece after some testing. And it's been proven not to cause damage to papers, but it still needs to be done in a very controlled way, a very low concentration, and make sure it's washed out completely afterwards. So it's quite a process to do. I hesitate always to tell people that I bleach papers because I don't want people to get the wrong idea that it can just, go into a bath with a little bleach. But it is one of the processes that a conservator does use to eliminate some of that staining. And so there's a little bit more of it. This was the wash water after the first wash. Nice dark brown. Second wash, we get a little bit more out. I will do multiple washes until there's no more brown in the water that's coming out. Yes?
Would you be using distilled water?
Yes, I actually used reverse osmosis water so it's been basically all the impurities have been removed. Don't want to just use tap water because there's all kinds of metal impurities and things like that can be in it. So it is very specific washing conditions as well. And that's just preparing for the bleaching treatment there. And there we get the before and after. A wonderful dramatic difference. I was really, really pleased with this treatment. There was a little bit of watercolor border around it too. There's a little blue line and a pink line around the edge. So that had to be addressed in a certain way because it was a little more soluble than the ink. So I had a coating on it to protect that during the treatment. Most of the staining came out. Not all of it. You'll notice it's not perfectly white again. I didn't want to push that treatment too far. I didn't want to, take it so far that it was going to look snow white again. We don't really want things to look like they were made just yesterday. So always in conservation, you're kind of looking for that balance between what's healthiest for the object and yet what allows it to be appreciated and used again safely. So there's still a little bit of patina on there, but you can now really appreciate the lines and the drawings and the penmanship on that, or at least you could if it wasn't on a blurry screen.
That's gorgeous. You don't know what happened to this fellow that did this? Did he become a minister, a professor, a teacher, a mathematician?
He certainly had some wonderful, wonderful skills and training to do that. I don't know. It was a close relative of the client who brought it in, so you know it was his father or grandfather who
Was
he
he
knew quite
cool?
well.
Was your client a cool guy?
Yeah, definitely. He was a nice guy. He actually had a lot of family artifacts that he brought in to be looked at. His siblings were also very interested in preserving the pieces that they had from their family. I think they were, probably going to divide them up between some of them. They had a couple family Bibles that they brought in as well. Yeah, it was a really nice one, and it went back into its original frame as well, because that was just a beautiful frame. But with new glass and new backer, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, to prevent any of that from happening again. So the next one is a photograph, and I had one of you mention photographs earlier, and their tendency to curl up and become brittle. And probably, I don't know, maybe photographs are the most common things that you guys have, I'm not sure. Again, I'm hesitant to suggest that you try very much of this, but we will talk at the end about what you can do. This one was an extreme treatment. I'm showing you extreme treatments because they're fun, they're dramatic. But this was a panorama photograph. I'm sure you've all seen them rolled up tight. Came from the Lambton County Museum this time. And World War I, Lambton 149 Battalion. They knew that when they brought it in, but they didn't really know what the image was because they couldn't open it. When they were trying to unroll that piece, it was breaking. So, they didn't want to open it too far and cause any more damage to it. So they brought it in that condition. I have a humidity chamber that I set up to allow careful, slow, controlled humidification of objects, which allows them to relax enough to open up. And so I was able to get that open without causing any more damage to it. And when we get it open, then we can see, there is a big long tear in it that was caused by that brittleness and handling. There was some surface dirt on it, so this is surface cleaning it. It might not look dirty. Some objects don't look dirty when you look at them, but oftentimes when you clean them, you find that there is quite a lot of grime on it, just from time. And then the repairs. So there's the repair process. Again, there's my Japanese tissue and my wheat starch paste, which I have some examples of up here that I can show you afterwards, and the tears that are going to be repaired. And I did some repair to the gelatin surface as well on the front, just where that crack and peak was after the repair. And afterwards we have the piece unrolled, able to be seen properly, and it is the 149th Battalion on their training grounds here in Canada before they were deployed to Europe. They had it treated for the centenary, so I think it was 2017. That was the 100th anniversary of when this troop was deployed to the war, and they had a big exhibition at the gallery in Sarnia and showed off a lot of their artifacts for that anniversary. So that was great. They didn't have a copy of that image anywhere, and you can see all those faces, and you might not necessarily have names, but from lists who was in that battalion, and then you can put an image to them. So I do things like that. Also, though, just people's ancestors' photographs. This one came in, a woman brought it in, it was her great-grandmother, and it had some damage to the photograph emulsion. probably insects. I would say probably silverfish eating away at that emulsion. They really like to eat any type of cellulose or starchy materials, so they had eaten away at that surface. And so the treatment, I basically in-painted the losses back to bringing it back to liquid like that. That sort of thing can be done with digital restoration as well, I'm sure you're aware, but I treat the physical object so that it can be looking its best again. There was also a break in the board along there. So yeah, those are smaller jobs, but they still come in regularly. I do big and large jobs. And then for books, I'm going to show you a family Bible. I do all sorts of books from valuable 16th century illuminated manuscripts to family Bibles. But I'm going to show you this because this is a pretty common thing in collections, family history collections. So this was a family Bible. It came in 1817. So it's fairly early. There are a lot of later ones, the sort of late 1900s ones with the beautiful gilded design on the cover, and I really like those ones too. This one's a little bit plainer because it's earlier, but they all tend to suffer from the same types of damage, and that is that front board coming off. They're so big and so heavy, and those boards are so heavy that with the opening over time, it's usually that leather joint that fails right along there. And then there's often damage to the first few pages as well. So treatment for that, actually it's really neat. You can see somebody has tried to fix it in the past. They've got these little tackets that they've kind of tried to tie the board on with. I love seeing old repairs. I just find them fascinating. And this one actually had a jacket, like a homemade jacket over the book too, that somebody had sort of stitched the corners of around it, which had protected it quite a bit and helped to keep that board on too. I end up undoing those treatments in the course of my restorations, but in that case, they didn't use tape. It was great. They used string instead, which is much less damaging. So a little bit of paper repairs to that's the front fly leaf with a nice family inscription on it. Some cleaning and repairs to that. And then the process for working on those Bibles is something that we call a reback. So I took the original spine off, reattached the board with a new cloth hinge underneath the leather, and then a new piece of repair leather was put on to that spine underneath the lifted original leather, and then the original spine gets laid back down onto it, so you retain all of the title information and everything on it, and it gives it new life. Then you can open it, use it as a book again without risking anything more falling apart. It's back to looking like a beautiful old book. You can put it, well, I wouldn't put this one upright on a shelf. I would probably want to keep this book flat, but a smaller book you can then put it back on your shelf with your other volumes. There's the inside to some repairs to that marble paper. I just toned some repair paper a similar blue, but I could go so far as to recreate that marbling as well and make the repair match the marbling. Just depends on how far the client wants to go. But that's a great one too. I wish I could show you a bunch of other books, but I don't want us to be here all day. Here's the last one I'm going to show you. And this one talks a little bit about problems of storage. And you probably find things stored in all kinds of ways when you're going through papers or documents. People just used whatever they had, whatever they thought would be good to keep something safe, and they don't always age well. This was a beautiful set of 2 architectural drawings brought in by a private client. They're the designs for their family house. They found it, they still have the family house. The client's mother still lives there, and they found these drawings with the house, and it's the original architectural drawings for the house. Absolutely beautiful. They're really beautiful. Two layers of them. The top one there that you can see covered in all that gunk is the floor plan layout of the house, and the second drawing underneath is the exterior. The exterior view was in almost pristine condition, but the first drawing had all of this, I'm just going to call it gunk. It had been stored. Now somebody, maybe right after they were finished being used, I don't know, somebody had wrapped them up in this oilcloth fabric. So they're nailed to a dowel along one side, and then this oilcloth was nailed on, and the whole thing rolled up together. It might make sense, you know, you think you're keeping it protected from moisture and dampness, but over time that oilcloth surface started to break down and transferred all of that gunk onto the top of the drawing. So much that you could barely make out any of the text or the layout of that drawing. So they brought it in hoping that something could be done for it. And I did a lot of testing to see what would work to remove that. And luckily it was actually very, very receptive to some solvent treatment. And there you can see it in raking light, also really heavy vertical striations from being stored rolled. But the oilcloth transfer did come off very, very well. Took a long time, because of course you're doing it sort of on a minute level with small swabs. But most of it came off. The drawings were on a starched fabric, so it wasn't on paper, it was a very fine, thin cloth, you know, common for architectural drawings. And then heavily starched, so a really shiny surface to the top of the drawing. And that, I think, had protected it somewhat and kept that oil stuff from penetrating in. So at least in areas where the starchy, shiny surface was intact, the oil stuff came off as well. And there were areas where it had been marred a little bit, probably by a bit of moisture, and it did kind of penetrate in and stain a little bit. But I was able to get most of it off. There's a shot of the nailing to the dowels there. So there it is. They had both of them framed. Now this is the one that was clean to begin with, but this is the one that was dirty. And now you can see those floor plans. They're marked. The rooms are labeled: chamber, kitchen, the windows, the measurements for the walls and windows and doors. British architect, because they have ground floor and first floor, and that's the foundation. So they've marked it ground and first. And a really neat little decal that the architect has drawn on. Plan of a house for Thomas Jebb, Esquire, and the architect's name R.W. Fawcett, architect, Petrolia, Ontario. I thought it was really neat to have that still with your family at your house. A lot of people don't, have anything left of their own families, but to have that still in the family that is still meaningful to you, I think is really nice. So they had both of them framed and to put up on display in the house. Okay, so now we're going to get to a section about what you can do, what types of things you can do for your own artifacts. Read it all. I'm going to go back to my notes for this a little bit though, so that I can make sure I get everything for you. So let's talk about what you can do to prevent your own items from going through some of those damages. First of all, I want to say know your limits. This is a rule that all conservators live by as well, and it's one that should apply to you too. I would never attempt a risky treatment without having proper training and having done proper research first, because I could be putting a valuable artifact at risk. And I hope that all of you will treat your artifacts with the same respect. That being said, there's a lot of ways that you can help preserve your items that will make a big difference in their condition. In general, less is more. Oh wait, there we go. So you don't want to risk causing any further harm by doing any aggressive treatments on something. Less is more. That's also a central tenet of conservation, that we are always trying to do the most minimal intervention that will make a difference to the piece. But, you know, I don't want to go in and do cleaning or anything just for the sake of doing it. It has to be just enough that's going to help the piece, but not to go too far and cause any damage to it. So a lot of times, conservators will end up just rehousing something and not necessarily doing a big treatment, especially in institutions. That's a lot of what they do, especially if they don't have conservation on staff. They're just wanting to make sure to protect it and keep it from getting worse. When in doubt, seek advice or call a professional. Myself and most other conservators that I know are always happy to talk to people about their objects and their concerns about things. So you can always give me a call, shoot me an email if you are worried about something or you want to know what would be the best thing to do for it. There are also lots of online resources, which I'll point out to you a bit later on about, with information and leaflets and things that you can access. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is environment, and what location is to a realtor, environment is to a conservator. What do I mean by environment? Relative humidity, that's the big one, RH. Also temperature and light and cleanliness of a storage area. Environmental conditions are probably the most important factor in the preservation of artifacts. Poor environmental conditions basically cause every other sort of damage to accelerate. And they can mean the difference between an old document with some wear but in decent condition, or one that's completely falling to pieces. High relative humidity, or RH, combined with high temperatures and strong light, accelerate the aging process of most materials. So the discoloration, the brittleness, the staining, and everything else becomes worse. Wide or abrupt fluctuations are the most damaging because they cause the materials to expand and contract quickly, which causes stress to the materials on a microscopic level, which weakens them over time. So if you think of a wooden door in an old house, in the summer it swells slightly and sticks in its frame, in the winter it contracts and it's loose. Well, all of your paper objects, anything of organic matter, is going through the same process during those changes, and that causes weakening of the materials as they go back and forth. Your artifacts generally like the same environment as you do. They like a moderate environment. Between 18 and 21 Celsius, what I usually say, and 45 to 55% RH. That's ideal, and in an institution that has climate control, that's around the area that you'll find they try to keep it. It's really hard to maintain that in your home over the course of the year in southwestern Ontario. But we do what we can, and we try to basically to mitigate the transition between summer and winter so that it goes kind of slowly and doesn't go too far to the extremes. So you can use humidifiers. We have a humidifier on the furnace, as a lot of them do. This doesn't do a lot of good in the winter. This is actually a picture of my little monitor in my house this week, and you can see I'm not doing a great job of keeping it between 45 and 55. The relative humidity is at 25% this week. Mm-hmm. But there's not a lot you can do. You do what you can. You can get these little monitors at most hardware stores or Lee Valley. They're around $20. So you can at least keep an eye on things as they go up and down. In the summer, dehumidifiers are pretty much essential, especially in any basement. I have 2 of them running all summer at our house. And that will keep it from getting astronomical. Also, running the air conditioning is very helpful for keeping that temperature even. So it's a great excuse to run your AC all summer. You want to keep that relative humidity definitely, you know, anything above 65 is getting kind of dangerous. Anything into the 70s is a really ripe opportunity for mold to start growing. So particularly in basements in the summer, it's very easy for it to get up into the 70s. Check on things regularly if you're getting into that area. Keep your artifacts out of the danger zones of attic and basement. And I know this is hard because that's where we all have storage areas, but those are the areas where things are most likely to happen to them. Attics are hot and dry, basements are cool and damp. If you do keep things in the basement, maybe your basement is finished or partially finished, don't store them, don't set them directly on the floor. Don't keep them in cardboard boxes. Cardboard is very hygroscopic and it will just absorb any moisture around there, particularly from the unfinished floor. And you'll find that's what's going to get damp and grow moldy first. So you can put them in plastic bins and keep them up on shelving if you can. And keep air circulation going around the room. And try not to put them right against exterior walls, particularly in the basement, but also on the main floor as well. Exterior walls get cold faster, and the reaction area between that colder wall and the interior warmer of the house is going to have potential for creating condensation and changes in the environment and cause damage. So keep things in a little bit from the walls. Keep them out of direct sunlight. You know, you're probably not storing them in direct sunlight, but if you're using them, if you're displaying them, you don't want them to be straight in a sunbeam because the UV rays in daylight are damaging to paper artifacts. They will cause aging and brittleness to the paper unless you have some sort of filtering in place. Okay, and just keeping things generally clean. You don't want dust and dirt to build up in that area because that kind of thing can be attractive to insects. That's another thing to watch out for, is to keep the space clean enough that you're not inviting bugs in. Silverfish are particularly damaging to paper-based collections. You can get little silverfish traps from, I'm not sure where exactly, I have to look that up. I think Lee Valley might even have them. But if you just set a couple of those up in the basement or wherever you're storing things, you'll be alerted if and when they do come in. And then you can do something before it gets out of control. But keeping things clean and dust-free will go a long way towards dissuading pests from coming in. Storage and display. So storage is another major factor in preventing damages to your artifacts. You want to have proper and safe storage conditions. Acidic storage materials like cardboard backers, cardboard boxes, wrapping something in newspaper or butcher's paper or plastic wrap, or poor storage methods like folding or rolling or storing in a tight space, those can all cause damage to your pieces. So you want to use archival protective enclosures to keep your things in. Boxes and folders are some great options. Archival means a lot of different things. It means acid-free. It means often they're chemically stable and tested not to react with artifacts. They may have an alkaline buffer in them to sort of, doesn't really get rid of the acidity, but it sort of balances the acidity of those papers. So when you're getting storage enclosures, make sure you're looking for something that says that it's archival and not just something from the drugstore or the dollar store or something like that. Storing things flat is best if possible. Obviously we don't always have the space to do that, but that's going to be the safest for them. You want to make sure that you keep like items together. keep photographs with photographs, keep documents with documents, keep newspapers together and keep them away from other things because we know that acid can transfer, and that will also keeping like shaped items together will keep them safer from when you're shuffling around so they don't catch on each other. If you're stacking things up, you can interleave them with acid-free tissue. I'll talk about suppliers in a minute, but you can get acid-free tissue that will, again, keep things from transferring to each other. And as I said, folders or boxes are great places to start. So you can get a lot of these pre-made. These are boxes that I just took the pictures from the Carr McLean website. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar. It's a library and archives supply company, Canadian, and they have a great website. These boxes come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. This is just one that's sort of intended for newspapers to fit in. But they're small, they're large, they're flat, they're boxy, these are upright, with acid-free folders for documents. I don't generally like upright storage for things. They tend to slump down, but you know, in a pinch, we can. Yeah, so there, see, it says there passes PAT. That's a standards test for, I think specifically for photographs, but they use it for a lot of materials. I think it's photographic activity test. Don't quote me on that. I have to look that up. But it's a standard for the chemical stability of those materials. For larger things or more unique items, you might have to have custom storage solutions for them. I do custom folders and boxes and Mylar encapsulations for things that come through my studio. You can make folders like that yourself. Use acid-free mat board and foam core, and just seal along one side. I do them with sort of a 4-flap paper structure inside so that things don't fall out the edges. But you can go and get some mat board and foam board and tape up one side. You can use tape as long as it's not going to get close to the artifact. And do be careful because they can sort of slide in and get stuck in the edge of the tape. But you can. There are linen framing tapes and paper tapes that are specifically archival that I would recommend using for that. And the same with Mylar encapsulations. You could do some of that if you really wanted to get into that and get some rolls of Mylar from places. And I seal up usually 2 edges so that it can be opened and get the picture out. Make sure you leave space around the edges. It's not the ideal way, but you can use double-sided tape along those 2 edges on the Mylar to seal them. But you just want to make sure there's quite a bit of space in there so that the document doesn't fall in and get stuck in that. And you know, I have certain ways that I do to block that and keep that from happening. It's an option for you. These are custom clamshell boxes for books, and I build these for things when people want some extra protection for their books. It's custom made to fit the book inside so the book doesn't slide around at all, and can be opened and closed, gets a little spine label on the back, and it can go upright on the shelf with your other books with the title and everything on it. If you really wanted to get into bookbinding and bookmaking, you could learn to make those yourself. There are instruction books out there for that. It's a fair bit of work, but you can. And they're a great way to keep something that's really delicate safe. So I said earlier about less is more, and sometimes just protecting something is the best thing that you can do for it. And a lot of times, if people bring in a book that is so far gone that the repair of it is going to be prohibitively expensive, what we'll do instead is just make a nice box for it, and then it keeps it from getting worse. You can take it out when you want to and look at it, but it's going to be safe. This is a plain version. This is a nice decorative version that I did for a gift book for a client with marble paper. Storing and labeling photographs is a tricky one. The Lambton County Archives website, I just did a quick search for what archives are recommending for this, and they're recommending putting things into polypropylene plastic sleeves, specifically designed for archival storage of photographs. Don't be getting them from the dollar store, because there will be differences in them. So you can individually slide those in there, and that's a great way then to be able to label them. You can put label stickers on the outside of that, or you could slip sheets of paper in behind and write on those in graphite. If you're going to write on any actual documents, which I would really discourage, but if you do want to make sure you're using pencil, graphite for that, and a soft pencil. Never any marker or pen or anything like that. It's probably self-explanatory, but so that's an option for a way to store photographs. You could also keep them in those boxes that we looked at with some tissue in between them. Conservation framing. So if you're going to display any of your pieces in your home, you want to make sure that they're protected while they're out in the light and exposed. Don't just take them to Michael's or wherever's cheapest, because they will use things in the framing that will cause damage to the pieces. You don't know when you get it back from the framer what they've done inside. They might have slapped tape all over the back, and they do. They might use spray mounting adhesive to put things on there, and you really don't want any of that to get on there. So I do conservation framing at my studio, and other framers will do it as well, but you have to talk to them and make sure that you're getting quality materials. The first thing is you want UV filtering glass on the front, and the glasses these days come with a UV coating that filters, I think, up to 99% of the UV rays, but I still wouldn't put it in direct light. And I have been told from the manufacturers that coating does degrade after about 7 years. So again, don't put it right in a sunbeam and forget about it. Inside, you want to use acid-free mat board, archival mat board, and for hinging of a piece, I always use either corner pockets or that Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste that I talked about. And not a lot of framers will do that. There are framing tapes that are manufactured that claim they're archival and reversible. And so a lot of framers will use that and say that that's fine. I don't use that, but talk to whoever's doing that and make sure that you're getting the best that they can give you. I don't trust any type of tape. So a lot of these companies, we'll talk about it actually in a minute, claim that their products are archival tapes. But they still have that sticky, they're still sticky, right? And they might have done testing, but we don't really know what's gonna happen down the line. I've never seen a tape that's more than 20 years old that hasn't caused problems to something. So I just would stay away from it completely. So with that Japanese tissue and paste that I use and conservators use, you know you're getting something that isn't gonna cause any damage to it. And you get an acid-free backer board, sometimes a moisture barrier. A lot of times I'll also seal the frame package, the glass and the backer with the piece inside, so that it's a little microclimate environment, which mitigates it from those changes in the environment. Doesn't prevent it from feeling that, but it will slow that down when it's contained in that. And it also keeps it away from the wooden frame, which is acidic. Wood is acidic. So that's what's involved in conservation framing. Reproductions and digital restoration are actually a really great option for keeping your artifacts safe. So if you have a reproduction made of it, then you can frame that reproduction, or you can handle that, or you can write on it and make notes on it, and you don't have to be accessing the original every time you need to look at it. It takes a lot of stress off of the original. And that's why in museum displays you'll often see what they're showing you is in facsimile rather than the original object, because they don't want to put the original on display and subject it to a lot of light and a lot of fluctuations in environment. And if you're getting a reproduction made, you can also at the same time have some digital restoration done on it. it can be a lot more cost effective than having conservation done on the actual object. And a lot of times you can bring back a faded image or faded inks in ways that I might not even be able to do. I don't do that myself, but I really highly recommend Color by Schubert here in town. Probably a lot of you are familiar with Roland down there. He does a wonderful job. He's got really big scanners and printers, so we can do oversized items. I send people to him quite a bit. Handling can cause a lot of damage to your objects as you're shuffling them around and using them. So if you are, if you're going to get something out and start looking at it, make sure that you first of all have a clean, clear table space that you're going to bring it to. You don't want to get something out, get halfway across the room and realize you have nowhere safe to set it down. So clear off a whole big table, make sure there's no food or drink close by, and when you're transporting it, it's best to carry an object on a support. So either a piece of mat board or a stiff piece of paper or board, so that you can then carry that across the room rather than carrying the document through the air. To use gloves or not? That's the question. Do any of you use gloves? What do you think about gloves? Anybody?
I've used the white archival gloves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there they are in the picture up there. You're probably all familiar with that. Places will show pictures of the curators holding those gloves, and they can be very useful depending on the object. I tend to stay away from them though. I actually recommend people when handling particularly paper documents. I find that they reduce your dexterity quite a bit. So when you're turning the pages of a book or leafing through papers, you're more likely to catch corners, and the brittle paper can shatter. But the gloves are really great if you're handling, well, certainly a photograph, which is more likely to take fingerprints, or any type of metal object that the surface might tarnish from fingerprints. That keeps the oils from your skin away from those objects where they're going to cause more damage than they would on paper. So I myself use and recommend just clean, dry hands. Wash your hands immediately before you go to handle your pieces. The oils on your skin will come back fairly quickly. I think I read a study recently that says that they come back within 10 minutes or something like that. But all the same, I think that the risk is lower with just using your hands than the potential damage. So clean, dry hands. Remove any rings that you're wearing or any jewelry that can catch on things, and make sure you're not wearing any hand cream, and ideally not any makeup either, because you can brush your hands and transfer that onto things. If you really don't want to touch the object, maybe it's dirty or maybe it's moldy, and you'll see in a lot of pictures where I'm doing chemical treatments, I'm using latex gloves, and I find that that's a good it's a good compromise to protect your hand or the object, but it gives you just a little bit more dexterity. They're thinner, and you can feel the sensitivities a little bit more in the objects. And I get those from Karma Clean too. There's a lot of variation in gloves. I wouldn't be just using like kitchen gloves. You want to get something that's thin and strong, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like medical grade. Make sure it's not powdered though. Sometimes they have like a powder on it. Yeah. So now we'll talk a little bit about cleaning and repairs. And as I said, I'm really hesitant to recommend that you do much of this yourselves, because there's a lot of potential for causing damage to things when you try to get into working on them without having experience. But I do know that you probably also really want to know what you can do for them physically. So we'll just talk about a little bit of things that you can do that can be fairly safe. If you do cleaning though on them, you can still damage them. Like it's easy to go too far and cause damage. So on your own heads be it. So light cleaning, you can start with a soft brush and just simply brush across the document. That will remove any, you know, loose particles, spider webs, that sort of thing. But always be careful. Now, I just want to say before you start, just use common sense. Examine the piece carefully first. And if you can, do a little bit of testing somewhere innocuous, maybe on the back, because whatever I tell you that you could do, there's instances where that also might cause damage. So, you know, I can say, oh, gently brush a document and that should be fine. But if it's a pastel drawing, no, that's going to cause damage. So none of these are like sort of one size fits all. They all really, really depend on what you're using it on and what the condition is. Again, if it's something really, really brittle that's already fragmented all over it, you don't want to brush it because that's going to cause more pieces to come off. So whatever you do, just really carefully think about your document first. Brushing is an option. Surface cleaning is an option. Again, not for everything. But if you feel that you want to try doing that, this is one that I use quite often. It's called a smoke sponge or a dirt eraser. Absorine is the brand that I use. It's a vulcanized rubber, so it's soft and spongy, and it picks up a lot of dirt, but without being too hard and abrasive. If you're just taking an eraser, you know, that could get a lot of dirt off of it, yes, but it also could really abrade soft papers. Like if you take an eraser on an old newspaper, you're going to make a mark on it. So stay away from that. This one though too, if you used that really aggressively on a soft paper, you could do damage to it. So be careful and use common sense when you're doing that. They come in sort of bricks. I have one up here as an example you can look at, and you just cut off as you've used it, the dirty areas. Document cleaning pads, that's another thing that Lineco is a company that makes a lot of these supplies, archival and acid-free cleaning supplies. Sometimes they're good, sometimes I don't really trust them so much, but they're out there, you'll see them. So they make this document cleaning pad. It's like a little sock with eraser particles in it, and they market it for cleaning documents and paper. So they can be good, but I do find that a lot of those crumbs fall out and get kind of scattered on your page. You gotta make sure you brush it off after. If any eraser crumbs are left in your paper when you put it away, that rubber eraser will age and become brittle, possibly leach plasticizers, and possibly stain the documents. So be careful when you're using those. Again, this is why I don't really like to recommend, because there's so many different factors that, you know, again, you might think that you're keeping something safe and protecting it, but it could also be causing more damage. Definitely never use those on books, because any type of eraser will, little pieces can get down into the gutter of the book and be nearly impossible to get out. So we never want to use a fragmented eraser on a book page. You can go through and remove all of the metal paper clips from your documents. Those will rust and stain over time. So archivists I know often recommend using these plastic paper clips instead. I don't really like them, to be honest. I find that they're likely to cause divots in the papers, but it depends on the type of paper. You know, if you just have a stack of things that you kind of want to keep together and they're not maybe that important or that rare, sure, you could do that on them. I would personally rather see you put it in an envelope though, to keep all those pieces together, or encapsulate in Mylar or something like that instead. But they are an option. That's the repair tape I was telling you about. That it's a different company, but it's called Filmoplast P, or you might see one called Document Repair Tape. And I don't know, the company will tell you that it's safe to use on your documents, but I really wouldn't. It's got a tape adhesive on it, said, we don't know what that's going to do in 50 or 100 years. But it's there, and it's an option in a pinch. You know, maybe you've got something that's not that important. Maybe it's just the reproduction of something that you want to keep from tearing further. You know, it's there as an option. Yeah, but in general, I mean, those are a few things that you can do for your documents within reason. But in general, I'd like to see you do less and really focus on keeping them safe through storage and environment. And you can really get into the storage things, and there's so many different boxes and tissues and things that you can use for things. I saw that Sheila, who's helped organize this today, has brought in a box of where she stores some of her documents, and it's got a binder system in it. She's left it out on the front so you can look at it as well. I've brought a catalog from Carr McLean so you can flip through and see what different types of boxes they have and other things. And I've got a few other things on the table for you to look at too, that eraser, some brushes and that kind of thing. So here we are. I hope that that has been interesting for you and given you some ideas on what you can do and what you shouldn't do. And may your documents live safely for many years to come. We have time for questions.
Two questions. When you're talking about bleaching or washing, what prevents that process from bleaching out the ink? Like, why doesn't the ink fade due to that process? And the other thing is, I'm sure it differs, but for every project you do, but how long will a simple project take?
Right. Yeah, I realized I didn't really mention that about the length of time or the cost of some of these treatments, so I will talk about that. But the washing and bleaching, it really depends on what the ink or what the media is. And some of them are very sensitive to that, particularly watercolors or any colored pigment is usually really sensitive to washing and bleaching. But some others, so that one particular, the Lord's Prayer drawing, was a carbon-based ink. It was probably India ink, which the particles in that ink that cause the blackness are carbon. And carbon is completely inert, so it's not going to fade or wash away. Now, fading is one thing, washing away is another, and that really depends on the binder that's in the ink. With watercolor, it's usually gum arabic, and inks have different materials that they is a binder to keep all the pigments together, the particles together. So it really depends. Some things will be affected and other things won't. And that's why I always do the extensive testing first, because there's a lot of things I can look at it, and I've had ones like it before, so I could say, oh yes, that's probably going to be fine. I still test it. But then other things you just sort of know, like that's not going to react very well. But it's always different. There's always surprises. I'll have things. I had one once. Somebody that I knew was treating a watercolor painting, and went to go and do a wash. All of the pigments were stable. All of the colors were stable. But when she washed it, the pink disappeared. Just the pink. So in all of those pigments, for some reason, that one color was sensitive, where everything else wasn't. It wasn't a huge deal. It was just a very small area in a sunset. But there's always surprises. So even when I start a treatment, I always tell people there's no guarantee. You know, I'm going to be doing as much as I can, as safely as I can for this piece, but there's no guarantee. There can always be surprises. So that's about the washing and the inks. As for the time and obviously the cost for these sort of things, it ranges a lot. It's generally expensive because generally everything is very time consuming. There's the testing stage, photo documentation. I take thorough documentation photos before treatment, usually during and after, and I provide those photos as well as a report of everything that was done with the piece when it goes back to the client. And that's important for future reference if somebody wants to see 100 years from now or 50 years from now you know, maybe something's going wrong on the piece and it needs to go to another conservator, and that conservator wants to see what happened, what did I do that might be causing that. I was looking at a slide collection recently at an institution, and they brought the slides out and they had like sort of a bloom on one side, and it looked like a mold growing, but I think it was really more like a bloom reaction in the gelatin. And they said a few years ago we had a student intern clean these, and there was no record of what that was. Like, what is cleaning? Was that, did they brush them off, or did they use alcohol on them or something? You know, you don't know. So I'm looking at these slides and I'm thinking, well, I don't know if this was caused by the slide materials or if it was caused by the cleaning. So that's why I always want to, and I do always provide thorough documentation about what goes on. So that's part of the process. And the actual work, of course, is very fine and time consuming. One might say painstaking. But it has to go slowly so that nothing goes wrong. You know, if I'm just like going along cleaning something really quickly and aggressively, I could cause a big tear, or I could cause something. I want to be going so slowly that if something starts to happen, I catch it before it happens to the piece. So more specifically, I would say it ranges from, you know, a few $100s to thousands of dollars. The big projects, like doing those oversized maps, tens of thousands of dollars for the time. It takes weeks and weeks. Smaller things like photographs or documents that only have a little bit to them, you might be looking at a couple or 300. And it really varies. Sometimes I can tell by looking at photos, so if you want to email me something, sometimes I can kind of give you a ballpark, but it does usually depend on doing some testing first to see how everything's going to react.
Can you restore a wax seal on a crown property deed?
What
Can it be done?
for restoring? How far? What are
Well,
you
it's
talking?
broken.
It's broken. Okay, so I can repair cracks and breaks in it. If there is, you know, if part of the design is missing, I can't recreate that. I don't, you know, have the cast for it, and I don't know what it necessarily would have been like. But certainly for big breaks and fragments that have come off, if you still have them, that can be addressed, yeah. Yes?
First of all, I'll introduce myself because you and I have been corresponding, Dan Brock from the Historical Society.
Oh, yes, hi Dan,
So you
how
know
are
who
you?
I am from face to it. What is the type of pencil that you'd recommend for writing on documents? So what you know, whatever the quality of it is, what is there a like HB something or other or whatever?
So most pencils should be just pure graphite in them. I think occasionally you might find some pencils that have a kind of a waxy substance. Certainly pencil crayon, there's a wax introduced with that pigment, so stay away from anything that's colored. But graphite is an inert material, so it's made of carbon, the same as those inks. So it's not going to fade, and it's, as long as it's just sitting on the surface, it's usually reversible. Now there is sometimes if it's really ground in, you might find you can't get it out. You want to use a pencil, I guess, that's sort of in between. You don't want to use too hard of a lead, so the H numbers get harder, and if you're using a hard one, you're more likely to impress in it, in the paper when you write, and that's going to make an indelible mark. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be too soft, because the graphite is too soft, it's going to spread and smear on the paper. So HB is, I believe, the middle one, the very center of it. I would stick around there, maybe a little on the softer side. You know, I'd rather have it be smudgy than be causing indents in the paper, and just go gently, because even with a soft pencil, you can still make indents if you do it too hard.
One other question was the dirt eraser. Where would you get those? At an art store or what?
I get them from Carr McLean, the supplier. The catalog is up here. There are a couple other providers. Brodart is one, Sheila was mentioning, and Gaylord is another American one. They're on the handout for you, but Carmaclean's Canadian, so I generally use them, although I've been told that Brodart is actually cheaper in terms of materials and even shipping, even though they're often coming from the States. You'd have to check if they have those as well. Document cleaning sponge, smoke sponge, but the basic material is vulcanized rubber. Yes?
Are you good at painting over the graphs?
That's like, it's sort of an associated skill, and I don't have training specifically in dating or appraising things. I don't do any valuations, but just from seeing a lot of things over the years and things that have come through, I can kind of get a general sense of when something might be from. I can't usually pinpoint it to a year, but there's certain processes and styles that you can sort of identify from a certain time period, like that chromolitho style is sort of late 1900s, but runs into the 1910s and teens as well. Sometimes just from the decorative style, you can pin it to a decade as well. I guess I'd say I dabble in that. I like to test myself. Sometimes I go through the library if there are any older Victorian publishers' bindings, and I like to test myself by looking at the cover and guessing what decade it comes from. So I can, but I'm not always accurate. But if you're looking for ways to do it yourself, there are certainly lots of books about printed documents that will talk about the styles and the periods that they were manufactured in. You're welcome. Yes?
I was gonna make a comment, both for you and the people around here, based on the things that you have. I've worked, every time I go to Malta, my wife is Maltese, I go to the National Archives there.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the area does not have any humidity control whatsoever, and it gets pretty hot in Malta, 40 and so on like that. Anyway, I look at these large bind ship lists of people leaving or cargo and so on like that, and they go way back to the 1800s and that. And they're all bound together, and you can see where the bookworms have been working their way through it, and also coal dust, because I think they burn coal dust.
Oh, yeah.
And so as you work on this, you're getting this a nice accumulation of it. So the first time I went there, I asked them if they had anything I could do to clean this off as I'm working, and they gave me a little 1-inch paintbrush.
Oh, yes.
Do it.
Mm.
And I did at least a teaspoonful after going through maybe 10 of these books.
Yes.
So when you
Yeah.
have the brushes there, that sort of reminds me of that.
Yes, yeah. Brushing out through the gutter.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't often clean every page of a book because that takes a lot of time. But in some of those ledger books, I have done it for archives clients. So going through page by page, I clean, mostly the edges have, from handling, have a layer of dirt. But yeah, it all accumulates in the center, and the brush is the best thing, just to softly brush that stuff out from the center of it. Yeah. Yes?
Another question about newspapers. What is it about the way they print newspapers now versus in the older days? Because I've done a lot of touching newspapers from way back, and you don't get the transfer of ink on your hands, but you do now, like the London Free Press.
Yeah.
You get a paper at home, you're just covered by the end.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on, certainly on modern printing
I don't think you want
methods.
to clean
but-
modern newspapers. It will just come off.
I think it's probably something to do with like a binder in the ink, but I would venture to say that it's possible that old newspapers, when they were fresh, would have transferred that ink as well, and that just over time, either the ink has set, or everything that's going to come off might have come off already. You've seen in the old, in movies or something, they used to iron the old newspapers, and that would set that ink so that the great lord wouldn't get his hands covered in ink. So I can't say for sure, but I think that the problem might be constant, and it's just something about the papers that are older where that has been mitigated, or whatever's gonna happen has happened already. Yes? You
I was
wanted to
just
say
gonna
something?
make the same comment about Downton Abbey where they
Yes,
were
yes,
ironing the
that's
papers.
exactly what I was thinking. Big Downton fan. Yeah. Anything else?
You brought up the point of an iron. This is about 30 or some odd years ago when I was doing some work at the archives up in Western there when it was in the regional collection. Often I bring these things at home and use steam iron to press out particularly the rag content newspapers.
Yes.
And it worked. Now, what is your reaction to that?
Well, what you're getting when you do that is a combination of the heat, yes, but mostly the steam. And when you're ironing something, it's the steam action, which is basically just the same as what I do when I humidify something. So it's a little bit of moisture that's going in and relaxing the paper fibers and doing that. And then with an iron, at the same time, it's putting heat and weight to set that back down. So the principle is the same as when I'm humidifying a document. Relaxes the paper fibers. After I do a humidification, I'm then putting it between blotter paper and under weight, and I change the blotter paper several times over the course of a few days to gently pull that moisture out. Well, it's the same reaction. An iron is just sort of a blunter object for doing that, and yeah, that's why it works. It does work. I would be careful ironing old documents.
I'm relieved to hear that I wasn't doing irreparable damage to it, because it did get the wrinkles out of these old newspapers. What we were doing was actually microfilming them. I had in my mind of taking all the newspapers that were ever published before the Free Press, which is 1849,
Yes.
and making a collection of them. We end up with 3.5 reels. Some were literally taken from framed on walls. It was a unique copy that was
Right.
issue and so on. And so
Right.
that was what got me to
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Now, I would say you wouldn't necessarily have caused damage, but you could very well cause damage if you were doing something and if you had used too hot of a setting, you could burn it. Like there's potential for it. A lot of treatments you'll find, like, used incorrectly, it can cause a lot of damage. Used correctly, it can be beneficial. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.